Most people think political collapse is loud, dramatic, and impossible to miss. But the truth is far more unsettling because it usually starts quietly behind closed doors with a single idea that seems absurd at first and then slowly exposes something much bigger. What you're about to hear isn't just about Greenland or tariffs or immigration. It's about how power really works when loyalty is demanded but never returned, how institutions respond when fear stops working, and why a president who thrives on chaos can suddenly find himself surrounded by resistance he cannot control. This story isn't told through breaking news alerts or viral clips, but through the moments in between, the silences, the hedging statements, the quiet revolts, and the decisions that never make headlines, but change everything. By the end of this video, you'll understand why what looks like political noise is actually a warning. Why the most dangerous phase of power isn't its rise, but its unraveling. And why this moment matters far more than most people realize. Stay with me because once you see the pattern, you won't be able to unsee it. And the final insight changes how this entire story should be understood. Imagine a quiet morning in Washington, the kind where the White House hallways look calm on the surface. But underneath that silence, something volatile is building. Phones buzzing in pockets, aides exchanging looks without speaking, everyone sensing that today is not going to be normal. And somewhere inside that building, Donald Trump is once again circling an idea that refuses to leave his mind. An idea that sounds absurd to the outside world, but feels powerful to him, Greenland. And in that moment, what begins as a foreign policy headline quietly transforms into something much bigger. A story about loyalty, ego, punishment, and a political system starting to fracture under the weight of one man's instincts. For Donald Trump, power has never been about institutions or process. It has always been about submission, about loyalty offered upward without question. And that is why this moment matters so much. Because while Trump demands absolute loyalty from everyone around him, he has never believed in returning it. And now, finally, members of his own party are beginning to understand the cost of that imbalance. When Senate Republicans push back, when even the most hawkish voices hesitate, Trump doesn't hear policy disagreement. He hears betrayal, and betrayal to Trump is unforgivable. That's why the Greenland episode isn't really about land or minerals or strategy. It's about control, about Trump testing whether the party still flinches when he speaks. And for the first time in a long while, the flinch doesn't come. Mike Johnson steps in front of the cameras, insisting nothing is happening, insisting there's no war, no invasion, no crisis. But what he's really doing is trying to hold together a House majority so thin that a single crack could bring the entire structure down. And when he blames the media or Democrats for exaggerating Trump's own words, it's not messaging, it's damage control. The contradiction is obvious and dangerous at the same time because Trump's legal argument to the Supreme Court is that tariffs are justified by national security. Yet his allies claim there is no national security threat when it comes to Greenland. And both of those things cannot be true at the same time. This is where the Senate revolt begins to harden, not as a dramatic rebellion, but as something far more threatening to Trump, a collective realization. Rand Paul doesn't sound emotional when he says there is no Republican support for this. Even among the hawks, he sounds methodical, institutional, like someone reminding the system that it still exists and that matters because Trump's power only works when people believe he is inevitable. Ted Cruz hedges, avoids full endorsement, talks around the issue instead of embracing it, and that hesitation alone sends a signal that Trump feels instantly. Then comes Bill Cassidy, and his story is the cautionary tale every Republican understands immediately because Cassidy did everything Trump demanded after impeachment. He humbled himself publicly. He voted in ways he knew were wrong. He chased approval that never came. And the moment he stopped being useful, Trump destroyed him politically without hesitation. That endorsement of Cassidy's primary challenger wasn't just revenge, it was a message. Loyalty to Trump is never protection, it's a delay. And watching that happen in real time forces Republican senators to confront a truth they've avoided for years. Trump will sacrifice any of them if it feeds his ego. This is where the collective action problem becomes clear. Because Trump can bully individuals, but he struggles against groups. and history shows it. When Republicans move together, when resistance becomes shared, Trump loses interest. He gets distracted. He moves on because sustained conflict requires discipline, and discipline has never been his strength. That's why Greenland, like the Epstein files before it, becomes another example of Trump overreaching, then retreating once the cost rises. And while this plays out on the international stage, the same pattern appears domestically through ICE, where power without accountability turns violent. And when voices like Ruben Galgo argue that more funding and more training won't fix an agency built on aggression and fear, they're not just critiquing policy. They're describing the natural outcome of Trump's governing philosophy. ICE becomes a reflection of Trump himself, unrestrained, unaccountable, protected by loyalists who refuse to see the damage because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging him. The debate over reform versus dismantling isn't rhetorical. It's fundamental, because you cannot tweak a system designed to intimidate. Just like you cannot gently manage a presidency driven by impulse rather than principle, Trump governs by instinct. And when institutions resist those instincts, he attacks the institutions, the courts, the Senate, the media, even his own party. And in doing so, he isolates himself. By the end of this chapter, the real conflict is no longer hidden. The Senate revolt is no longer hypothetical. And Trump's greatest enemy is no longer Democrats. It is his inability to sustain loyalty in a system that finally understands what he really is. And that realization is only just beginning. The moment the Senate resistance becomes public, everything inside Washington shifts. Because once dissent leaves private conversations and enters the record, it can no longer be contained. And Donald Trump feels that shift immediately. Not as a policy problem, but as a personal threat to his authority, which is why his reaction is not strategic, but punitive, instinctive, and loud, lashing out at individuals rather than addressing the substance of the rebellion, a pattern that has defined his entire political life. Behind the scenes, Republican senators are having conversations they have avoided for years. Quiet but urgent exchanges about survival, not ideology, because they now see the same thing Democrats have seen all along, that Trump does not protect allies. He consumes them, and once that realization sets in, fear begins to change direction. The House, meanwhile, is operating in a state of barely controlled panic because Mike Johnson knows something Trump does not, that numbers matter more than loyalty, and when margins are razor thin, even symbolic chaos becomes dangerous. Every time Trump floats another escalation, another tariff threat, another vague national security justification, Johnson sees not strength, but instability. And instability is poison for swing district Republicans who already feel the ground moving beneath them. This is why Johnson gaslights so aggressively, why he insists nothing is happening even as everyone can see that something very clearly is, because admitting reality would force him to choose between defending Trump and defending the institution he leads. And he knows those two things are no longer aligned. In the Senate, that separation becomes clearer by the day, because resistance there is not emotional. It is procedural, rooted in constitutional language, statutory limits, and the kind of slow, grinding pushback that Trump finds impossible to counter. When senators talk about tariffs originating in the House, about emergency powers being abused, about courts stepping in, something Trump has always feared. They are moving the fight onto terrain where his instincts do not work. Trump thrives in chaos, in ambiguity, in spectacle. But institutions respond to clarity. And the clearer the legal and constitutional boundaries become, the smaller Trump's room to maneuver gets. This is why he turns his attention back to punishment, to examples, to making sure everyone sees what happens to those who fall out of line. Because fear has always been his preferred enforcement mechanism. But the problem is that fear only works when people believe compliance will save them. And Bill Cassid's political execution proves that it will not. That lesson ripples quietly through the Republican conference, changing calculations in ways Trump cannot see because he mistakes silence for submission, not realizing that silence can also be preparation. And while all of this unfolds, the media ecosystem amplifies the chaos and fragments. Disconnected clips, surface-level outrage. But the real story is deeper and slower. A governing coalition losing coherence, a party realizing it has tied itself to someone who cannot be managed, disciplined, or restrained. This erosion becomes even more visible when the conversation shifts to ICE, because immigration enforcement exposes the moral consequences of Trump's worldview more clearly than almost any other issue. Ruben Galgo's comments cut through the usual talking points precisely because they refuse to accept the comforting lie that better training or more funding can fix a system built to intimidate. And that refusal forces Democrats, especially centrist ones, into an uncomfortable position. For years, incrementalism has been their shield. The idea that every broken system can be nudged back into alignment with enough tweaks and reforms. But ICE under Trump resists that logic because it is not malfunctioning. It is functioning exactly as designed. Violence, racial profiling, lack of accountability, these are not bugs. They are features of a structure that draws its legitimacy from fear rather than consent. And that is why the debate becomes existential rather than technical. Trump's defenders argue that enforcement equals security. But what they never explain is why security seems to require dehumanization, why order demands brutality, and why accountability is treated as weakness. This is where the Greenland episode and the ICE debate intersect. Because both reveal the same governing instinct, the belief that power is most effective when unchecked, when decisive action replaces deliberation, and when dissent is framed as disloyalty. The Senate revolt threatens that instinct directly because it introduces the idea that limits still matter, that even a president obsessed with dominance can be constrained, and that idea is more dangerous to Trump than any election loss, as pressure builds, Trump grows louder but less focused, cycling through grievances, attacking multiple targets at once, diluting his own message. And this scattershot approach signals something important to seasoned political observers. Not confidence, but stress. Trump does not retreat when he feels strong. He retreats when he feels overwhelmed, when the fight becomes too complex to dominate through sheer force of personality. And that is exactly where this moment is headed, toward a confrontation not defined by a single dramatic collapse, but by a slow accumulation of resistance, legal obstacles, institutional friction, and political fatigue. By the end of this chapter, the question is no longer whether Trump can push his agenda, but whether he can maintain control over a party that is starting to recognize that survival may depend on letting him fail, and that realization, once it takes hold, does not go away. By the time this conflict reaches its third phase, the energy inside Washington has changed completely because what began as deflection has turned into exhaustion. And exhaustion is the most dangerous state for a political movement built on fear and spectacle. Donald Trump can survive outrage. He can survive scandal. But what he cannot survive easily is sustained resistance that refuses to react emotionally. And that is precisely what begins to form across multiple fronts at the same time. The Senate no longer treats his threats as urgent crises, but as procedural problems, scheduling hearings, invoking statutes, asking courts to intervene. And every one of those steps strips Trump of the oxygen he relies on. In the House, Mike Johnson's balancing act becomes increasingly unsustainable because the more he denies reality, the more obvious it becomes that reality is winning, and members in vulnerable districts start to calculate how much longer they can afford to be tied to chaos. Behind closed doors, Republican strategists whisper about timing, about distancing, about whether letting Trump self-destruct might be safer than continuing to defend him. And those whispers are never meant to reach him because everyone understands that Trump reacts to fear with retaliation, not reform. Meanwhile, Trump himself grows increasingly erratic, jumping from Greenland to tariffs, to immigration, to personal grievances, unable to focus on a single narrative long enough to dominate it. And that loss of narrative control is not accidental. It is the result of too many fires burning at once, each one demanding attention, each one exposing limits he cannot spin away. This is where the media war intensifies, not in Trump's favor, but against him, because even sympathetic outlets struggle to reconcile his claims with visible institutional pushback. And when allies begin to hedge on air, it signals to audiences that something is wrong beneath the surface. Trump senses this shift instinctively, and his response is predictable: louder rhetoric, harsher attacks, more extreme framing. But volume cannot replace coherence, and over time, it only accelerates fatigue. The ICE debate becomes a flashpoint precisely because it forces a moral clarity that Trump's style cannot easily obscure. And when Galgo and others argue that accountability, not expansion, is the only path forward, they are implicitly accusing the administration of valuing power over people. That accusation resonates beyond partisan lines because stories of abuse, profiling, and violence are no longer abstract. They are personal, local, and impossible to dismiss as isolated incidents. Centrist Democrats attempt to reframe the issue as a training problem, a management problem, anything that avoids confronting the structure itself. But that avoidance begins to look like complicity, and grassroots pressure grows in response. What makes this moment different from past controversies is convergence. Immigration enforcement, executive overreach, foreign policy recklessness, and constitutional conflict are no longer separate debates. They are pieces of the same story. And that story is about a presidency that cannot operate within limits. Courts loom larger now, not as abstract arbiters, but as active participants. And Trump's reliance on emergency powers becomes a liability rather than a strength, because every invocation invites scrutiny, delay, and potential reversal. The Supreme Court, once treated by Trump as a safety net, now represents uncertainty. Because legal arguments grounded in national security lose credibility when policy appears impulsive rather than strategic. Trump's frustration grows, and frustration has always been his tell, leading to impulsive decisions that create new problems faster than his team can contain them. Republican senators notice this, not with outrage, but with calculation, understanding that the more Trump lashes out, the more he alienates potential defenders. This is the psychological turning point, because Trump's authority has always depended on the belief that he is feared. But fear, without respect, collapses into resentment, and resentment eventually turns into resistance. By now, even loyalists understand that defending Trump requires them to absorb damage he will never repay. And that realization changes behavior in subtle but significant ways: missed calls, delayed statements, carefully worded responses that neither endorse nor attack. Trump interprets this as betrayal, but in reality, it is self-preservation. And self-preservation is stronger than loyalty. When loyalty guarantees nothing, the administration begins to feel hollow. Decisions announced without follow-through, threats issued without escalation, and for the first time, Trump's opponents stop reacting to him as if he is unstoppable. That shift in perception is quiet but powerful, because once inevitability disappears, so does much of his leverage. By the end of this chapter, the presidency feels less like a force moving history and more like a storm burning itself out. Loud, destructive, but increasingly contained by structures it cannot overpower. And everyone watching understands that the final act is approaching, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a reckoning shaped by institutions, fatigue, and the limits Trump has spent years pretending do not exist. By the time this story reaches its final stage, the chaos no longer feels explosive, but revealing. Because what has been exposed is not just the fragility of one presidency, but the limits of a political culture that tolerated it for far too long. Donald Trump does not fall because of a single scandal, a single vote, or a single act of defiance. He weakens because the system he tried to bend finally refuses to move at his speed. And that resistance, slow and unglamorous, is precisely what democracy looks like when it works. The Greenland fantasy fades into the background, not because it is resolved, but because it loses its power to intimidate. And that loss matters more than any policy outcome, because Trump's greatest weapon has never been action. It has been fear. In the Senate, what began as hesitation solidifies into distance, then into quiet independence. And senators who once flinched now calculate, understanding that Trump's anger is temporary, but electoral consequences are not. In the House, Mike Johnson's denial becomes irrelevant because reality no longer needs validation. Voters can see dysfunction on their own, and gaslighting loses its effectiveness when contradictions pile too high to ignore. The courts continue their methodical work, stripping emergency powers of their mystique, forcing arguments into daylight, and reminding the country that authority must justify itself, not demand obedience. On immigration. The ICE debate crystallizes a broader truth that systems built on dehumanization cannot be repaired through optics, and that real security cannot coexist with unaccountable violence, a realization that pushes Democrats toward a choice they have long delayed, whether to manage injustice more politely or confront it directly. What ties all of this together is a single uncomfortable lesson. Donald Trump did not invent these fractures. He exploited them. And when exploitation is no longer profitable, the explorer loses interest. Trump grows quieter, not humbled, but distracted, shifting focus, repeating grievances, unable to sustain a narrative that no longer commands the room. And that is how his influence recedes. Not with a bang, but with diminishing returns. The Republican Party, left to survey the damage, faces its own reckoning, whether loyalty to a single man was worth the erosion of credibility, the loss of institutional respect, and the normalization of chaos as governance. This is the moment where responsibility can no longer be outsourced, where blaming media, Democrats, or history stops working, and where choices finally matter. For the public, the takeaway is neither comfort nor despair, but clarity. Democracy does not collapse all at once. It erodes slowly when fear replaces accountability, and it recovers slowly when people insist on limits. What happens next will not be decided by Trump's next outburst, but by whether institutions, lawmakers, and voters remember what this period revealed about power without restraint. And that is why this story does not end with Donald Trump. It ends with us, with the question of whether we recognize these warning signs when they appear again, whether we demand more than loyalty tests and spectacle, and whether we understand that democracy survives not because leaders are virtuous, but because systems are defended by those willing to resist abuse, even when it is inconvenient. If this moment teaches anything, it is that unchecked power always overplays its hand. And when it does, the only thing that determines the outcome is whether people are paying attention.